The day I realized my children had stopped loving me was not the day my husband died. It was the day I sat beside my kitchen phone for 6 straight hours and understood that nobody was going to call. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 72 years old, and for 48 years, my husband Robert was the center of my world. When he passed away, everyone told me the same thing. They said time would help. They said family would get me through it. They said I would never be alone because I had wonderful children. Looking back now, I think those words hurt more than the silence that followed. The funeral was held on a cool October afternoon in Columbus, Ohio. The church was full. Friends came. Neighbors came. My son Jason stood beside me. My daughter Emily held my hand while people offered condolences. For a few hours, I believed we would get through the loss together. I believed we would stay close because that was what families did. That night, after everyone left, I walked into the house and felt the emptiness hit me all at once. Robert's recliner sat by the living room window exactly where he had left it. His reading glasses were still on the side table. His coffee mug was still in the dishwasher because I couldn't bring myself to move it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I remember standing in the hallway listening for sounds that would never come again. The next morning, Jason called. The day after that, Emily sent a text message asking how I was feeling. I told myself they were trying their best. They had jobs. Families. Responsibilities. I didn't want to be the needy mother who demanded attention. So I kept busy. I watered the flowers Robert had planted. I organized old photo albums. I baked the apple pie he loved every Thanksgiving. Days turned into weeks. The calls became shorter. Then less frequent. Then something strange happened. I found myself checking my phone before breakfast. Then again after lunch. Then before bed. Every vibration made my heart jump. Every unknown number gave me hope. Most of the time, it was a telemarketer or a pharmacy reminder. Never Jason. Never Emily. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. Growing cold beside me. Outside, the maple trees were turning orange and gold. I remember staring at the phone, convinced one of my children would call. Surely someone would want to know how I was doing. Surely someone would wonder whether I was eating properly or sleeping at night. Hours passed. The sunlight faded. Shadows stretched across the floor. Still nothing. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No messages. No voicemail. Just silence. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. What if they only stayed close because of him? The thought felt cruel. Unfair. Yet once it entered my mind, I couldn't push it away. That evening, I sat alone at the dinner table with enough food for one person and a feeling I couldn't explain. It wasn't grief. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. A quiet realization that losing my husband might not have been the only loss waiting for me. And I had no idea that a conversation waiting inside a lawyer's office would soon change everything I thought I knew about my family. The weeks after that evening settled into a routine I never would have imagined for myself. Every morning, I woke up at 6:30, the same time Robert and I had always started our day. For nearly 5 decades, there had been another cup beside mine at the breakfast table. Now there was only one. I still found myself reaching for 2 plates sometimes before catching the mistake. Little habits linger longer than people realize. November arrived with colder air and shorter days. The neighborhood looked beautiful. Leaves covered the sidewalks in shades of red and gold. Families decorated their porches for Thanksgiving. Everywhere I looked, life seemed to be moving forward. Mine felt frozen. Jason called once during the entire month. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. He sounded distracted. I could hear voices in the background and what sounded like a television. He asked how I was doing before quickly mentioning that he needed to get back to something. Emily sent a text message 3 days later. She attached a picture of her youngest daughter wearing a soccer uniform. I stared at the photo for several minutes. Not because of the picture itself, but because it was the first glimpse I had seen of my granddaughter in almost 2 months. I typed a long response. Then deleted it. Then typed another. In the end, I simply wrote that she looked beautiful. The reply never came. Thanksgiving was always Robert's favorite holiday. He loved having everyone gathered around one table. He would spend hours preparing the turkey while pretending he was the head chef of some famous restaurant. The memory made me smile as I stood alone in my kitchen the day before Thanksgiving. Part of me expected an invitation. Surely someone would call. Surely one of my children would ask where I planned to spend the holiday. The call never came. On Thanksgiving morning, I baked a pumpkin pie from scratch because it was what I had always done. The smell filled the house with familiar comfort. For a brief moment, I almost felt normal again. Then I looked around and remembered there was nobody coming. Late that afternoon, I opened social media. I rarely used it, but loneliness makes people do strange things. The first photograph I saw stopped me cold. Jason and Emily were together with their families. They were smiling around a large dining table covered with food. My grandchildren wore matching sweaters. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked comfortable. Everyone was there except me. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I was angry. The truth was much worse. I was beginning to understand something. Nobody had forgotten me. Nobody had been too busy. Nobody had simply lost track of time. Plans had been made. Invitations had been sent. A gathering had happened. And at no point had anyone thought to include their mother. That night, I washed my dishes, wrapped the untouched pie, and placed it in the refrigerator. Then I sat alone in the living room, listening to the grandfather clock Robert had inherited from his father. Tick. 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 Each second felt louder than the last. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. My heart jumped. I reached for it immediately. It was not one of my children. It was a voicemail notification from an unfamiliar number. I pressed play. Unaware that the message waiting for me would lead directly to the lawyer's office and the first secret Robert had left behind. I listened to the voicemail 3 times before I fully understood what I was hearing. The voice belonged to Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had handled several legal matters for Robert over the years. His tone was calm and professional, but there was something unusual beneath it. He explained that Robert had left instructions requesting a meeting with me under certain circumstances. He did not say what those circumstances were. He only asked that I contact his office when I was ready. The message ended with a phone number and a simple statement that Robert had wanted me to hear. I sat motionless in my chair long after the recording ended. Robert had always been thoughtful. He planned everything. Birthdays. Vacations. Retirement. Even small household projects somehow ended up organized in neat folders with handwritten notes. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. The next morning, I called the number. Daniel answered personally and offered me an appointment the following week. His voice carried the same careful tone from the voicemail. He did not reveal any details over the phone. He simply said that Robert had cared deeply about my future and had wanted certain matters discussed face to face. The days leading up to the meeting seemed unusually long. I found myself thinking constantly about Robert. Not the final months when illness had slowed him down, but the man he had been for most of our marriage. Strong. Steady. Observant. He noticed things other people missed. More than once, he had quietly predicted situations that later proved true. One evening, while sorting through old photographs, I came across a picture taken during a family barbecue nearly 10 years earlier. Jason was laughing beside Robert near the grill. Emily was helping set up folding chairs. The grandchildren were running across the backyard. Everyone looked happy. Looking at that photograph, I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Not because those years were gone, but because I could no longer tell whether I had imagined the closeness that seemed so obvious in the picture. By the time the appointment arrived, a light snow had begun falling across Columbus. I drove downtown carefully and parked outside the office building. Daniel greeted me warmly when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered, his hair noticeably grayer, but his expression remained kind. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he opened a file folder resting on his desk. Then he removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. The sight of those familiar letters nearly took my breath away. For a moment, the room disappeared. It felt as though Robert himself had reached across time to place that envelope in my hands. Daniel waited patiently while I stared at it. Finally, he spoke. He explained that Robert had left several personal instructions before his passing. One of them involved that letter. Another involved a conversation he believed I might someday need. I looked up at him, confused. Daniel folded his hands and sighed softly. Then he said something that immediately sent a chill through me. Robert was worried that after he was gone, certain people in your life might reveal who they truly are. At that moment, I realized this meeting was not about the past. It was about something Robert had seen coming long before I ever did. I looked down at the envelope resting in my hands. The paper seemed heavier than it should have been. For several seconds, I could not bring myself to open it. Robert's handwriting stared back at me, familiar and comforting in a way that made my chest tighten. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first line alone brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am no longer sitting beside you making bad jokes and stealing bites of dessert when you are not looking. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. As I continued reading, his words felt less like a letter and more like a conversation. He spoke about our years together, our first apartment, the long road trips we took before we had children, and the countless ordinary days that had quietly become the best parts of our lives. Then the tone shifted. Robert wrote that there was something he had worried about for years but never wanted to discuss while he was alive. He said he had noticed changes in the family dynamic that concerned him. Not dramatic changes. Small ones. The kind most people ignore. He noticed how often conversations turned toward money. He noticed how quickly family gatherings ended when there was nothing to gain. He noticed who called simply to talk and who called only when they needed something. I lowered the letter and stared across Daniel's office. Memories began surfacing immediately. Moments I had dismissed at the time. Jason asking about property values during holiday dinners. Emily suddenly becoming interested in estate planning whenever certain topics came up. Little comments. Little questions. Nothing that seemed alarming by itself. But together they formed a pattern I had never fully acknowledged. Daniel remained silent while I finished reading. Near the end of the letter, Robert wrote something that stopped me completely. Margaret, if there comes a day when you begin to feel invisible, do not assume you have done anything wrong. Sometimes people reveal their priorities only after they believe they no longer need to hide them. I read that sentence twice. Then 3 times. My hands trembled slightly. Not because I believed Robert was accusing our children of being bad people. That was not his style. Robert never rushed to judgment. What frightened me was the possibility that he had seen something I refused to see. When I finally looked up, Daniel opened another folder. Inside were notes Robert had left with specific instructions. Some involved financial matters. Others involved me personally. Daniel explained that Robert wanted me to take time before making any major decisions about the future. More importantly, he wanted me to pay attention. Observe. Listen. Allow people to show me who they were without interference. Then Daniel said something that surprised me. Your husband believed the truth would become obvious if you stopped doing all the work to hold everyone together. The drive home felt different. Snow drifted softly across the windshield as I replayed those words. Again and again. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. For years, I had been the one making every phone call, sending every birthday card, organizing every holiday gathering, and maintaining every family connection. For the first time in my life, I was going to stop. I was going to step back and see what happened when I was no longer carrying the entire relationship by myself. The first week felt strange. The second week felt uncomfortable. By the third week, I began to understand exactly what Robert had been trying to tell me. For the first time in decades, I stopped being the person who held everything together. I did not call Jason on Sunday afternoon. I did not send Emily reminders about upcoming birthdays. I did not text photos of old family recipes before the holidays. I simply waited. At first, I expected someone to notice immediately. Surely one of my children would wonder why I had suddenly become quiet. Surely they would ask if I was feeling well. Days passed. Then weeks. Nothing happened. December arrived, bringing Christmas decorations to every house on my street. Neighbors hung lights from their rooftops. Wreaths appeared on front doors. Holiday music played softly in grocery stores and coffee shops. Everywhere I looked, people seemed busy preparing to spend time with family. Meanwhile, my phone remained silent on the kitchen counter. One afternoon, I decided to conduct a small experiment. Emily's birthday was approaching. Normally, I planned weeks in advance. I always mailed a card, bought a thoughtful gift, and called first thing in the morning. This year, I did none of those things. I wanted to see whether she would notice. Her birthday came and went. 3 days later, she sent a brief message asking whether I had seen a photograph she posted online. There was no mention of the missed birthday call. No question about whether I was all right. No sign that she had noticed anything different at all. I stared at the message for several minutes before setting my phone down. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because I had forgotten her birthday. I never would have. What hurt was understanding that my role in her life had become so small that my absence barely registered. Christmas morning was even harder. I woke before sunrise and made coffee in the same kitchen where Robert and I had spent nearly every Christmas together. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the neighborhood. The scene looked peaceful. Inside, the house felt empty. Around noon, I received a group text message from Jason. It contained 4 photographs. The children opening presents. Family members gathered around a fireplace. Plates piled high with holiday food. Everyone looked cheerful. The message underneath read, "Merry Christmas from all of us." There was no invitation. There had never been an invitation. They had already celebrated together. Once again, I learned about it afterward. That evening, I sat in Robert's recliner for the first time since he passed away. I looked around the quiet room and finally admitted something to myself. The problem was not distance. The problem was not busy schedules. The problem was that I had spent years doing the work of maintaining every relationship. The moment I stopped, the relationship stopped moving too. And the most painful part was realizing that nobody seemed to care. Still, I remembered Robert's letter. Observe. Listen. Pay attention. So I remained silent. Because for the first time in my life, I was beginning to see the truth clearly, and what I saw was far more revealing than anything my children could have said aloud. January arrived with bitter cold and grey skies, but something unexpected happened. The loneliness that had felt unbearable a few months earlier began to change shape. It was still there, but it no longer controlled every hour of my day. Instead of sitting beside the phone waiting for someone to call, I started filling my time with things I had neglected for years. One Tuesday morning, I noticed a flyer on a bulletin board at the local library. A support group for widows met every Wednesday afternoon. I almost walked past it. Then I remembered how often Robert encouraged me to try new things instead of hiding from life when circumstances became difficult. The following week, I attended my first meeting. I expected sadness. What I found was something entirely different. There were women from all walks of life. Some had lost their husbands recently. Others had been living alone for years. They shared stories. They laughed. They talked about rebuilding their lives. For the first time since Robert passed away, I spent 2 hours without checking my phone once. That realization surprised me. Over the next several weeks, my world slowly expanded. I joined a volunteer program at a local food pantry twice a month. I started having coffee on Saturday mornings with 2 women from the support group named Carol and Denise. I even signed up for a beginner watercolor class at the community center. The paintings were terrible, but nobody seemed to care. We laughed at our mistakes and encouraged one another. Little by little, the house stopped feeling like a waiting room. It started feeling like a home again. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork in my study, I came across several old financial folders Robert had kept. Looking through them reminded me of something important. Throughout our marriage, we had been careful planners. We worked hard. We saved consistently. We built a comfortable future together. Yet during the months after his passing, not one of my children had asked how I was managing emotionally. Not one had asked whether I needed help. Strangely, that thought no longer made me cry. It simply made me think. Around that same time, Daniel Brooks contacted me to schedule a routine review of my estate documents. During our meeting, he explained that many people update their plans after major life changes. His suggestion seemed practical. Nothing more. Still, as he spoke, I found myself thinking about Robert's letter. Observe. Listen. Pay attention. I realized I had been doing exactly that for months. The picture was becoming impossible to ignore. The people checking on me regularly were not my children. They were neighbors, friends, volunteers, relative strangers who expected nothing from me. Meanwhile, the people I had spent decades supporting seemed content with occasional messages and distant holiday photographs. Driving home that afternoon, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking why things had changed. Instead, I started asking what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. And somewhere between those 2 questions, a decision quietly began to form, one that would eventually change everything. The decision did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly, growing stronger each time I looked at my life with honest eyes. A few days after meeting with Daniel, I returned to his office carrying a folder filled with documents Robert and I had accumulated over decades. Property records, investment statements, insurance policies, charitable donations. The paperwork represented a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and careful planning. Daniel reviewed everything patiently. Then he asked a simple question. What do you want these assets to accomplish after you are gone? I expected the answer to be obvious. For years, I had assumed everything would eventually pass to Jason and Emily. That was what most parents did. But as I sat there considering the question, I realized I was no longer certain. The issue was not punishment. I was not interested in revenge. I still loved my children. Nothing could change that. The issue was purpose. Over the previous year, I had learned something important. Love and gratitude were not the same thing. Obligation and genuine care were not the same thing either. I thought about the food pantry where volunteers greeted me by name every week. I thought about Carol driving across town when my car battery died. I thought about Denise bringing homemade soup when I caught a winter cold. These people had shown me kindness without expecting anything in return. Meanwhile, my own children seemed perfectly comfortable living their lives without making room for me in them. Daniel listened quietly while I shared those thoughts. Then he explained several options available through estate planning. Some involved charitable giving. Others involved educational funds and community programs. As he spoke, an idea began taking shape. By the end of that meeting, I instructed him to begin drafting substantial changes. Part of our estate would establish a scholarship fund in Robert's name for students pursuing skilled trades. Another portion would support the food pantry that had helped so many local families. Additional funds would go toward community programs supporting older adults living alone. I also created provisions for several people who had become important parts of my life. Nothing extravagant. Just meaningful acknowledgements of genuine friendship and kindness. When I returned home that afternoon, I felt surprisingly peaceful. There was no anger. No dramatic sense of victory. Only clarity. For the first time since Robert passed away, I felt fully in control of my future. Over the following months, the documents were finalized. Every signature felt less like taking something away from my children and more like giving something meaningful back to the world Robert and I had spent our lives building. I never mentioned the changes to Jason or Emily. There was no reason to. They rarely asked questions about my life anyway. And yet, as spring approached and the final paperwork was completed, I could not shake the feeling that something was about to change. Because sometimes the truth remains hidden only until money enters the conversation. And very soon, a single careless comment from a distant relative would set events into motion that none of us could have predicted. The change began so subtly that I almost missed it. One Saturday morning in early May, my phone rang while I was watering flowers on the back patio. It was Jason. Not a text message. Not a forwarded photograph. An actual phone call. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He asked about my health. He asked whether I needed anything around the house. Before ending the conversation, he suggested we have lunch together sometime soon. After we hung up, I stood quietly beside the garden. Something felt different. 2 days later, Emily called. She sounded unusually cheerful. She wanted to know whether I would like to join her family for dinner the following weekend. During the conversation, she mentioned several memories from childhood and repeatedly told me how important family was. The timing struck me as strange. For more than a year, contact had been sporadic and distant. Suddenly, both of my children seemed eager to reconnect. At first, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps they had finally realized how much time had passed. Perhaps they genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship. But as the weeks continued, certain details began catching my attention. Jason asked several questions about my financial situation. Nothing direct. Just casual comments disguised as concern. Had I considered downsizing the house? Was I still working with the same attorney? Had I made any updates to my plans for the future? Emily's questions followed a similar pattern. She often steered conversations toward practical matters involving property, investments, and long-term planning. One evening, while having coffee with Carol and Denise, I mentioned the sudden increase in attention from my children. Denise listened carefully before asking a question I could not answer. What changed? I thought about it for a moment. Then I remembered a conversation from several weeks earlier. At a family gathering hosted by a distant cousin, someone had mentioned seeing me leave Daniel Brooks's office. The comment had seemed harmless at the time. Now I wondered whether it had traveled farther than I realized. The possibility lingered in my mind. Over the next month, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Invitations arrived regularly. Jason offered to help with household repairs he had ignored for years. Emily stopped by with baked goods and thoughtful gifts. Both of them suddenly seemed interested in every aspect of my life. Outwardly, I remained polite and grateful. Inwardly, I observed. Just as Robert had asked me to do. The hardest part was recognizing how badly I still wanted their attention to be genuine. I wanted to believe they had returned because they missed me. Because they loved me. Because family mattered. But every conversation seemed to circle back toward the same subjects. Future plans. Legal arrangements. Financial decisions. One evening, after Jason left following a lengthy visit, I sat alone in the living room and looked at Robert's photograph on the mantel. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I smiled sadly. He had seen it long before I did. The truth was finally standing in plain sight. And although my children believed they were rebuilding trust, they had no idea that every document had already been signed, every decision had already been made, and the future they imagined waiting for them no longer existed. 3 years later, the room was quiet except for the sound of papers being arranged on a polished conference table. Daniel Brooks sat at the head of the room exactly as he had so many times before. Jason and Emily sat across from one another, both dressed formally, both carrying expressions that tried to appear respectful but could not entirely conceal their anticipation. By then, I was gone. Age had finally caught up with me, gently and without drama. My final years had been peaceful. I spent them surrounded by friends, meaningful work, and a sense of purpose I never expected to find after losing Robert. The loneliness that once haunted me had long since faded. What remained was gratitude. Daniel began reading the documents. The opening sections covered routine matters, personal belongings, family heirlooms, charitable instructions. The atmosphere remained calm. Then he moved to the portions everyone had truly come to hear. The scholarship fund in Robert's name received a substantial endowment. The food pantry received enough support to expand its services for years. Community programs for older adults received significant contributions. Several close friends were acknowledged with personal gifts and letters. As each section was read, the expressions around the table slowly changed. Confusion replaced confidence. Surprise replaced certainty. By the time Daniel reached the final pages, Jason and Emily understood that the future they had imagined was not the one waiting for them. They were not completely excluded. I had never wanted that. Each received a modest inheritance along with family keepsakes and photographs that held genuine meaning. But the majority of what Robert and I spent a lifetime building had been directed elsewhere. After a long silence, Daniel opened one final envelope. It contained a letter addressed to both of my children. He began reading aloud. My dear Jason and Emily, if you are hearing these words, then my journey has ended and yours continues. Before you feel disappointment, I hope you will listen carefully. This decision was never about money. It was about attention. It was about presence. It was about the difference between being remembered and being valued. After your father passed away, I waited. Not for gifts. Not for financial help. Not for grand gestures. I waited for phone calls. For visits. For simple moments that remind a mother she still matters. What hurt most was never what you did. It was what you stopped doing. The room remained silent as Daniel continued. I wrote that love cannot be measured through inheritance. It is measured through time, kindness, and effort. I explained that the people who stood beside me during my hardest years expected nothing in return. They showed up because they cared. They taught me that family is defined not only by blood, but by presence. The final paragraph was short. I hope this letter does not leave you feeling punished. I hope it leaves you feeling thoughtful. The greatest gift your father and I ever gave you was not money. It was opportunity. What you do with that opportunity will always matter more than anything written in these pages. When Daniel finished reading, nobody spoke for several moments. There was no argument. No dramatic confrontation. Only silence and reflection. Later, Daniel would tell me through the notes I left behind that both of my children sat there for a long time after the meeting ended. Whether they felt regret, sadness, or understanding, I cannot say. What I do know is this. In the end, I stopped measuring my worth by who called me. I stopped waiting to be chosen. I built a meaningful life anyway. And that turned out to be the greatest inheritance of all.